Attempts to criminalize rescues at sea fail again. The case against aid workers in Greece has been dropped after 4 years of costly legal wrangling. But will humanitarians be deterred or inspired? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Well, for 4 years, 24 defendants have been awaiting trial in Greece. From the outset, human rights groups called the charges against them farcical, and in legal terms, the case arguably proved to be just that. Over a lack of proper translation, questionable jurisdiction, and the vagaries of espionage law, prosecutors called for the trial to be annulled for all foreign defendants. Now, the case dates back to 2018 when several members of the NGO Emergency Response Center International, or ERCI, were arrested. 4 of them were held in pretrial detention for over 100 days before being released. This week, after 4 years and numerous delays, their trial finally began. Rights groups say the charges were trumped up, but still, if convicted, the defendants could have spent up to 20 years in prison. Among the allegations were the illegal use of radio frequencies, forgery, and espionage. There were also spying allegations based in part on the defendants' use of an encrypted messaging service, also known as WhatsApp. Well, among the defendants were Irish-German Sean Binder and Sarah Mardini, who gained fame when the story of her and her sister was dramatized in a Netflix film. Now, Mardini is a Syrian refugee who fled Europe using people smugglers to cross the Mediterranean Sea. She garnered international attention after it emerged that she and her sister saved the lives of fellow asylum seekers on that crossing. Both accomplished competitive swimmers. They helped pull a broken raft to the shores of Lesbos Island. Mardini was not in court for the hearing today, as she is barred from returning to Greece. But fellow defendant Sean Binder, a trained diver, was in Lesbos.
It is simply a procedural mistake that means that this cannot proceed. And if this same tactic gets deployed again for the felony trial, which we're still waiting to happen, it's 15 more years of waiting, of errors. All we want is justice. We want this to go to trial. And it doesn't seem like that will happen anytime soon, given what happened today. At the same time, we have been so lucky to have so much support internationally, everywhere. And I think that has forced the prosecution, this court, to at least recognize the mistakes made.
Well, Human Rights Watch and the UN had called on the Greek prosecutor to drop the charges, saying the case effectively criminalizes life-saving humanitarian solidarity for migrants. The ERCI stopped operations in 2018 after its aid workers were arrested. In 2021, Greece passed legislation that made it almost impossible for NGOs to adhere to registration requirements. Now, Greece's center-right government has described its migration policy as strict but fair, but they won't comment on the case. More than 80 politicians in the European Parliament signed a letter in support of the defendants, including Irish MP Grace O'Sullivan. She says this trial being dropped is not the end, but a step in the right direction.
Good news from Greece. We've just heard that Sean Binder and the other search and rescue humanitarian workers have had their charges dropped. The prosecution essentially was full of holes. Unfortunately, Sean Binder still faces felony charges in other courts, so we don't know how long that's going to take. But today is actually a step in the right direction.
Outside court, demonstrators have shown their support for the defendants, while multiple human rights groups say this trial was deeply flawed from the beginning.
Amnesty International was at the beginning of this trial as observers because we consider this a very important case of criminalization of solidarity in Greece, but in Europe altogether. So we consider the charges brought upon Sean Binder, Sarah Mardini and the others as baseless.
So for years now, governments like Italy and Greece have tried to stop aid workers from rescuing migrants at sea, and filing criminal charges was the latest attempt to do that. But how badly is it failing, and what example does it set? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Lesbos Island, Ines Avelas. She is the head of Advocacy and Strategy at the Phoenix Group. Nicola Canestrini joins us from Lake Garda in Italy. He's a criminal defense lawyer and the lead defender of the Juventa 10 crew. And in London is Adriana Tidona, a European migration researcher at Amnesty International. Thanks all so much for being with us. Adriana, I'll start with you. The prosecution of this case in Greece has been really a shambles. I mean, it took 4 years to get to today, only to really annul the charges over issues of jurisdiction, other technicalities. Are you relieved at this point that this annulment was reached, or angry that the case was allowed to continue for this long?
Well, Amnesty International has argued from day one that this trial should have never happened. So indeed, now the case has been sent back to the prosecution on the technical and procedural reasons. But we should not forget that in Sarah and Sean's case, serious felonies are still pending 4 years on. And we believe today's decision is really giving an opportunity to the Greek authorities to end the prosecution against Sarah and Sean and put an end to this ordeal that has been lasting way too long already.
Tell us a little bit more quickly about those serious penalties you say are still pending, or those other cases that are still pending. It's hard to get real clarity. We know that Sean and in the Mardini case, and Sara Mardini have had their cases annulled, but there are non-foreigners apparently who are still up against a trial.
Yes, we understand that some people have been sent back to be tried. And in addition to this, the trial that has taken place today, though, there is also a pending investigation into felony trials. So this was a trial into misdemeanors, but Sarah and Sean specifically are still facing charges for smuggling, membership of a criminal organization, and fraud. So the case is not over, unfortunately.
Okay, so that's what was difficult to understand, because from what the reports were initially hearing, that Sean and Sara Mardini were actually off the hook. They're not. Okay, so good to know that. Ines, let me ask you, I mean, what was the point, do you think, what has been the point, it's not over yet, but I mean, what has been the point of trying to try this case? What do these governments want?
I would argue that the point of this, or many of, or all of the other cases that are currently pending, are a way to scare humanitarian workers to do this type of job. So to stop, be part of search and rescue missions, and to support saving lives of people fleeing and in need of international protection. I think it's very clear, and in a way that they don't declare the total prohibition of search and rescue, because they know that will bring many critical from the international community, including the European Commission. But in this way, they use the traditional judicial system to stop this type of missions.
You know, Ines, Sean Binder, we heard him say he was actually pretty desperate to go to trial. He wanted his case heard. He may or may not get that day. I mean, it's already been 4 years. He still hasn't gotten his day in court. What's lost there?
I think what is lost in Greece, for example, there is currently no search and rescue mission anymore. Because of the fear, because of the practical possibility of doing so. Another consequence was the increase of the number of deaths at the GSC, also in other parts of the Mediterranean, but for sure the end of the search and rescue missions in Greece. And for the defendants, for themselves, is having their life in a legal limbo for years and years and years, without being able to continue both their own lives, but also continuing to do that job that they like to do it.
Nicola, I want to talk about the Juventa crew in just a second, but first I want to get your initial reaction to the judgment, the annulment today in Greece.
Yeah, what I would like to say is we have some parallels to draw here, because as we can state and as we can witness, the case against the Juventus crew is started in 2016. We had the hearing started this year, so it was 7 years of investigation. And why is that happening? Because this chilling effect, which Ines was speaking about, is a huge side effect which benefits, from which the prosecution benefits. Because, of course, no other sea rescuers would dare to go on sea if they knew that colleagues of them are prosecuted or investigated for crimes that in Italy lead to 20 years of conviction, possible conviction. So I would like to kind of point out the fact that this length of the investigation could be a strategy from prosecution. Having long investigation does give benefit to prosecution and investigator, and is a stop to this what they called illegal migration. The other thing that I would like to point out just from this moment on is that the investigation and prosecution are there are a lot of mistakes of it. In the Juventus case as well, the judge sent the case back to prosecution for one time, and we hope the judge, the court, is going to send the case back to prosecution another time. And this could, I would say, amplify this chilling effect and this length of investigation. So we in this initial few words, we can draw the parallel from Italy to Greece.
Right. You know, it's amazing because these are European Union nations that have signed up to international human rights accords at the most basic all the way to the most complicated levels. These are the nations that are pride themselves on most defending democracy and human rights. Yet it seems they want to have it both ways, you know, by trying to criminalize this kind of humanitarian work and also criminalize people who are seeking safety. Nicola, how can they try to do both?
They can't. They can't. So Italy was a founding member of the European Convention of Human Rights, meaning that since over 70 years we agreed to uphold fundamental rights in Europe. Now the problem is that the public opinion, and which are the voters, they seem to be against this migration waves, or people on the move, as we like to call it. And this gives the government the opportunity, the governments, to seek how they could stop that, because they would like to be voted again. So on one side, Italy is bound on the conventions. On the other side, the governments, they try to kind of make public opinion and their voters happy. How can they do that? Because they invent administrative sanctions. They try to make sea rescue as difficult as possible. And as it happened in the Juventus case, the Minister of Interior asked the police specifically to search for possible crimes being committed on high sea. So it is not difficult to start with an idea of a crime, then investigate for years and years, for decades. And even if at the end nothing comes out, because saving lives cannot be a crime, in Italy, the effect is still there.
Right. I mean, Adriana, whether or not they're found guilty, like we've said, this has been years of lawyers and stress, and for some it's been time in detention. So what is the chilling effect of that, if you could speak a little further? Because some argue it actually only really serves to build the resolve of other aid workers.
Yes, absolutely. As you correctly say, the investigation has been going on for over 4 years. It's been since 2018 when Sarah and Sean have also spent time in detention. This has a clear, I think, objective to create or worsen the chilling effect on civil society as a whole in Greece, really, and keep people's lives in limbo. What we have seen, I believe, since 2016 is a real shift in the perception of humanitarian help in Greece and beyond. NGOs and humanitarian workers have really gone from friends to foes in a way. There their work was first celebrated. They were seen as people aiding the authorities in responding to migration movements, and all of a sudden they are now enemies in a way and perceived as troublemakers. I believe at some point Greece authorities even called them leeches of the system. So there is a fundamental shift in the way humanitarian help is being portrayed, and Sarah Sean's case is certainly an emblematic presentation of this change of trend, but it's not the only one. Amnesty International has been researching this phenomenon for years now. In 2020, we issued a report which details cases not only in Greece but also in Italy, in France, in Switzerland. So it's really a EU-wide tendency that fundamentally goes against what Europe and European countries have signed up to, not only in terms of search and rescue obligation, but also in terms of the protection and promotion of human rights defenders and humanitarian work.
Yeah, Ines, I mean, again, as Nicola was also describing, there's this contradiction in what the European Union stands for and the statements it's made. We have the European Parliament describing this as the largest case of criminalization of solidarity. So what exactly does that mean, especially when it has its own members working to the opposite extreme?
Yes, I would say that obviously these are national policies, but they are national policies supported by not everyone within the European institutions, but supported by the European institutions. Because if not, the European Union has instruments that could lead to stop some of these actions, these or other problems within the asylum procedure. So, I remember that in 2020, the European Commission, when it came to visit to Greece after more violent incidents and after the open policy from the Turkish side, the comment of the European Commission was the European Union is fully supporting Greece because Greece is the shield of Europe. So I think that demonstrates that, okay, this is European or national policies, but the European Union supports this policy too. Although obviously there are elements or members of different European institutions that are against and have been publicly speaking about it.
Right. You know, Nicola, if we look at the individual defendants, some of whom you are obviously working with, and then there's, Sarah Mardini, for example, who had to swim across the Mediterranean Sea to safety and who could have easily died if she stayed in Syria. And now we're looking at countries trying to prosecute people who simply didn't want to die in her case. I mean, I hate to focus too much on one person, but in her case, there is this kind of element of star power, if I can put it that way. Does that help the work you do to have a case that can be used as an example for the person that others can really, in a sense, relate to and admire?
Yes, because we have to be reminded, as it has been told you before, from the other discussants, that there are many cases, I would say tens or maybe hundreds throughout Europe. Those cases, they don't have the attention of public opinion. They don't have the attention of prepared lawyers. They don't have the money to defend themselves properly, to pay lawyers, consultants, interpreters, translators, and so on. So it's always useful to have some strategic litigation on this point, because we can, and that's exactly what we're trying to do with the Juventus case, point out which are the systemic deficiencies of the national laws, which allows investigators and prosecutors to try and maybe convict people who didn't do anything than trying to save themselves or trying to save others from drowning. May I add something here? We cannot forget that those aid workers, those sea rescuers, are those people who help, those NGOs help the governments to fulfill their international obligations Because if the countries would do what they agreed to do, signing the most important agreements regarding search and rescue, for example, on sea, there wouldn't be the need of NGOs at all. And so
Right.
you may remember, let me add something if I can, the Lampedusa shipwreck in October 2013. There was over 260 deaths, 60 children were, they died on sea. And in that moment, Europe understood that they need help for helping people on the move not to die on sea. And then something happened, as it was been stated, something changed politically, and maybe there was a political regime, so a political mind behind that, because that strategy cannot be just casual. So it couldn't happen just because it happened. Somebody probably started to think how to reverse the mainstream, and they were really successful. So it's now up to us in courts to fight against the prosecution and to show people that no crime has been committed.
Right. Adriana, if we look at the case, part of the argument is that in the Greek case especially, that they believe these rescue operations should be left up to the Greek Coast Guard. And that, one of the biggest charges is espionage here. Actually, Sarah Mardini was charged with espionage as well. You could face up to 8 years in prison for it. And they're saying it is illegal to monitor those Greek Coast Guard radio channels. So they're trying to separate, the work of the Greek Coast Guard and what the aid workers do, saying there's a conflict here and it risks kind of national security. What kind of argument is that from Amnesty's perspective?
Well, again, Amnesty International has examined, has assessed the case file against Sarah and Sean, and there is a reason why we have come out saying that these charges against them are baseless. In the specific case of espionage, we have argued that the radio frequencies were free and open radio frequencies that were listened by anybody, essentially. And again, the activities of Sarah and Sean as part of the organization they were volunteering for, because we must remember that Sarah and Sean were unpaid volunteers doing this solely for humanitarian reasons, was simply part of their job patrolling and monitoring the sea to assess if there was anyone in need of rescue. Again, this falls squarely, I think, in the activities that NGOs conduct as part of their normal job. We must also remember that in Greece, pushbacks and violations of human rights are rampant and have become arguably more rampant since NGOs are no longer monitoring or are effectively not allowed to monitor the sea. So this is also a byproduct, I would say, of criminalization. And the Greek authorities have been accused of that, including by Amnesty International, based on what our research has shown.
Adriana, I have to ask you this as well, because there are kind of humanitarian issues now on both sides in another respect. Once they say this is now the responsibility of the Greek Coast Guard or the Italian Coast Guard in certain cases, what does it do to those workers who are taking orders from above that at first told them to help these people who are in desperate need and are now being told to potentially allow them to die at sea because you work for a government now that says that this migration, this seeking of asylum is illegal? What does it do to those Coast Guard workers themselves to have to enforce a policy that could lead to the death of innocent people?
Well, again, this depends on which rules we are talking about specifically, but we would argue that rules that go against human rights standards and principles, including the duty to save lives at sea, are not legal duties, are not rules that are compliant with international human rights standards. And we have seen Greece trying to do this in many different ways, not only through criminal proceedings or in a way attempting criminal trials like in this case, but also by limiting NGOs' activities, imposing restrictive obligations in terms of registration, who is allowed to work in camps. There are very many different ways that Greece is trying to limit the ability of NGOs to operate.
Okay, we just have a minute left. Let me get some final words quickly. Nicola, go ahead.
Yeah, what I have to say is that we defense attorneys in Italy, me, Francesca Cancellaro, Sandro Gambrini, which are the defense team of the Juventa crew, we will do what we have to do in order to avoid that exercising a moral duty rather than not a duty enshrined in conventions, that this is not going to be considered a crime. So I can assure you, those interpretation of the laws, they will not pass through courts, and I am sure that even in this case we will get them acquitted as they have to, as it happened in all the other cases so far.
Okay, Ines, I'm going to have to offer my apologies. The clock is truly against us. I'd really like to thank all three of you so much for being with us. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers, but do thank you and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.